My name is Aaron Holloway, and I'm 11 years old. I guess you could say I'm a bit different from most kids my age. I've always been the quiet one, the kid who sits at the back of the classroom and gets lost in his books. My teachers call me gifted, but to be honest, I don't feel special. Not in the way they mean, at least. I just notice things. Small things, strange things, that most people don't see. It's like there's a world beneath the surface, hidden away, and I've always had this strange knack for peeking into it. I live with my parents, Susan and David Holloway, in a creaky old house on the edge of town. It's the kind of house that's filled with the echoes of the past, squeaky floorboards, walls that hold whispers, and a basement I'm not too fond of. My mom says it has character, but I say it's just plain creepy. Still, it's home, and it's where I've spent most of my life. Until 2 years ago, it was the four of us. Mom, Dad, me, and Ryan, my older brother. Ryan used to be my hero. He's 3 years older than me, so growing up, I always looked up to him. He was the brave one, the funny one, the kind of brother who'd stand up to bullies for me and sneak me candy when Mom wasn't looking. But that all changed when he turned 12. It's hard to pinpoint exactly when it started, but something inside him shifted, like a shadow crept into his smile. He became distant, angry, and unpredictable, like a storm rolling in with no warning. Then, just like that, he was gone. Mom and Dad sent him away without much explanation, something about needing help, needing time. I was 9 then, and I didn't understand. I was just heartbroken, missing the brother who used to play games with me, missing the person who felt like my best friend. Now he's back. After 2 long years, they brought him home. But the boy who returned isn't my brother. Not really. The first time I saw him again, standing on our front porch, it was like looking at a stranger who happened to be wearing Ryan's face. His eyes weren't the same. Dark, hollow, and almost empty. It wasn't just that he had grown taller or that his voice had deepened. It was something else, something unsettling that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. "Hey, Aaron," he said, smiling, but it wasn't the kind of smile I remembered. It was thin, like he was forcing it, like he knew what it was supposed to look like but couldn't quite make it reach his eyes. "Hi, Ryan," I managed to say, my voice small and uncertain. Mom pulled me into the kitchen after he went upstairs to unpack. She tried to reassure me, saying he was better now, that we had to give him a chance. But her hands were shaking, and I could see the worry lines etched deep into her forehead. Dad barely said a word that evening. He just sat at the dinner table, staring at his plate like it held all the answers. It was during that first night that I knew something was very wrong. I couldn't sleep. I kept staring at the ceiling, listening to the creaks and groans of the house. It's always been noisy at night, but there was something different about the sounds now. It was almost like a voice, a whisper I couldn't quite make out. I thought maybe I was imagining it, that it was just my mind playing tricks because I was nervous about Ryan being home. But then I heard it. A low, rasping voice coming from the room next to mine. Ryan's room. "Aaron." The voice called, almost a hiss. My heart started pounding in my chest, loud enough that I was afraid he might hear it through the walls. Slowly, I got out of bed, my bare feet cold against the hardwood floor, and crept toward the door. It was open just a crack, enough for me to peek inside. The room was dark, but I could make out Ryan's silhouette sitting on the edge of his bed, his head hanging low like he was talking to himself. But there was something else. A shadow on the wall behind him, shaped like a person but not quite right. It flickered and swayed, like it was alive, like it was feeding off the darkness. "Ryan?" I whispered, barely audible. His head snapped up, and I saw his eyes gleam in the darkness, reflecting the faint moonlight streaming through the window. He wasn't alone in there. I could feel it, a presence that made the air feel heavy, like trying to breathe underwater. "Go back to bed, Aaron," he said softly, but his voice was different, deeper, almost like 2 voices speaking at once. I stumbled back, slamming my door shut. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely turn the lock. I pressed my back against the door, sliding down to the floor, trying to make sense of what I'd seen, what I'd felt. It wasn't just fear. It was something deeper, something primal, like every part of me was screaming to run, to get as far away from him as possible. The next day, I decided I had to confront him. Not directly. No, I wasn't brave enough for that. But I had to know what was happening to my brother. I had to know if he was really still my brother or if the person in our house was something else entirely. There's an old mirror in the hallway, one that's been there since before I was born. It's big, framed in dark, twisted wood, and Mom says it belonged to her grandmother. I've never liked it. It always feels like it's watching you, like the reflection is just a fraction of a second behind. As I passed by it that morning, I noticed something strange. In the reflection, Ryan wasn't alone. There was a shadow standing right behind him, tall and dark, with elongated fingers resting on his shoulder, almost like it was whispering into his ear. My breath caught in my throat. I spun around, but there was no one there. Just Ryan, standing at the end of the hallway, staring at me with those empty eyes. "You saw it, didn't you?" he asked, tilting his head like he was studying me, like he was curious. I couldn't speak. My mouth had gone dry. "It's better if you pretend you didn't," he whispered, and then he smiled that thin, twisted smile again. "For your own good, little brother." That night, I heard the voice again. It was louder this time, calling my name from inside Ryan's room. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had to know the truth, even if it meant facing whatever had taken my brother from me. I pushed open his door and stepped inside, the floor cold beneath my feet. "Aaron," the voice said, not Ryan's voice, but something darker, something ancient. The shadow was there, draped over him like a cloak, its long fingers curled around his neck. Ryan looked up at me, and for a brief moment, I saw it. The real Ryan, my brother, trapped behind his own eyes, pleading with me. "Help me," he mouthed silently. I knew then that whatever this thing was, it wasn't my brother. And I had to find a way to save him, before it was too late. But the shadow turned its gaze on me, and I felt its cold grip around my heart. And I knew, with a bone-deep certainty, that it wasn't going to let him go easily. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. It felt like my lungs had turned to stone, and the room was closing in on me, the air heavy and cold. I took a step back, my heart racing as the shadow wrapped tighter around Ryan. He was shaking now, his hands gripping the bed frame like he was trying to hold on, trying not to be pulled under. "Ryan," I cried out, but it was like shouting into a void. He couldn't answer me. The thing in the room with us didn't want him to. I did the only thing I could think of. I ran. I sprinted down the hallway, nearly tripping over my own feet, and grabbed the mirror off the wall. It was heavy, the glass shimmering strangely as if it was made of liquid. I could feel something pulsating beneath my fingertips, like a heartbeat. I didn't know why I grabbed it, only that it felt important, like it was the key to something I couldn't understand yet. I dragged it back to Ryan's room, slamming it against the doorframe. The noise was deafening, but it felt like the mirror itself wanted to be here, like it was pulling me toward the darkness. The shadow recoiled, hissing like steam escaping a boiling kettle. It turned its head slowly, almost lazily, as if acknowledging me for the first time. I held the mirror up, angling it so it caught the moonlight and reflected it onto the dark figure clinging to Ryan. For a second, I saw it clearly. A face twisted with malice, eyes burning with a deep, otherworldly hunger. It wasn't human. It was something ancient, something that had crawled out of a place far beyond the world I knew. Ryan's body convulsed, his mouth opening in a silent scream. I could see his face in the mirror now, twisted with pain, and behind him, the shadow seemed to be unraveling, like smoke caught in a strong wind. "Let him go," I shouted, though my voice cracked with fear. "You can't have him." The shadow flinched, pulling away from Ryan slightly. He gasped for air, his eyes clearing for just a moment. "Aaron," he managed to whisper, his voice broken and raw. "It's the mirror. It's trapped. In the mirror." I didn't understand at first, but then it hit me like a bolt of lightning. This thing, whatever it was tied to the mirror. It wasn't just an old family heirloom. It was a prison that had cracked open, letting the darkness seep out and take hold of my brother. I didn't have a plan, no idea how to fight something like this. But I knew I had to act fast. The shadow lunged at me, its elongated fingers stretching out like claws, but I swung the mirror toward it, catching its reflection in the glass. It screamed, a sound that made my bones vibrate. The shadow writhed, twisting and coiling like a snake trapped in a jar. I could feel the pull, the suction of the mirror drawing it back in, like it was a vacuum trying to seal the creature inside. Ryan collapsed to the floor, breathing heavily. The shadow's face was still visible in the glass, pressed up against the inside like a man behind a window, eyes wide with rage and desperation. I held the mirror steady, my arms shaking. "What do I do?" I whispered, looking down at Ryan. He lifted his head, his eyes full of tears. "You have to seal it, Aaron. It needs blood. Family blood." My mind raced. I understood what he was saying, but the thought of it terrified me. I was 11 years old. I didn't want to hurt myself. But then I looked at Ryan, and I realized he was already hurt, trapped in a nightmare he couldn't escape from. If I didn't do this, I might lose him forever. With a deep breath, I pressed the edge of the mirror against my palm, wincing as the glass cut into my skin. Blood welled up, dripping onto the reflective surface. The shadow inside the mirror screamed again, a sound that rattled my teeth and made my vision blur. The mirror glowed faintly, the blood spreading across the glass like it was being absorbed. I could feel a tug, like the mirror was pulling something out of the room, something dark and heavy that didn't belong here. And then, just like that, it was gone. The shadow, the whispering, the coldness in the air, it all vanished, leaving the room feeling strangely empty, like the silence after a thunderstorm. I dropped the mirror, and it hit the floor with a thud but didn't shatter. I fell to my knees, clutching my bleeding hand, trying to catch my breath. Ryan was lying on the floor, his eyes closed. For a terrible moment, I thought he wasn't breathing, that I'd been too late. But then he sucked in a deep shuddering breath and opened his eyes. "Aaron?" he croaked, his voice small and scared, like a child waking up from a bad dream. I crawled over to him, pulling him into a hug, tears streaming down my face. "You're okay," I whispered. "You're okay now." He hugged me back, weakly but genuinely, and I could feel his heart beating against mine. It was him. It was really him. The next morning, I told Mom and Dad everything. They didn't believe me, of course. How could they? They thought I was just traumatized, that I'd made it all up to cope with how strange Ryan had been acting. But Ryan knew. He remembered everything. He hugged me tight and thanked me, his eyes filled with a gratitude I couldn't put into words. We never spoke about the shadow again. We didn't have to. We just tried to move on, to put the pieces of our lives back together. I hid the mirror in the attic after that. I wrapped it up in an old blanket and shoved it into a dark corner, where the light couldn't reach it. Sometimes, late at night, I can still hear faint whispers coming from up there, like someone calling my name. But I ignore it. I pretend I don't hear it. I know the shadow is still trapped inside, waiting. It's a warning, a reminder that some things are better left alone, buried in the darkness where they belong. But deep down, I know the truth. One day, the mirror might crack again. And next time, I might not be able to save my brother. Weeks went by, but the chill of that night never truly left me. Ryan seemed different, quieter. He laughed less, and when he did, it didn't sound like it used to. There was a hollowness to it, like the echo of a memory. He spent a lot of time alone, staring out the window or scribbling in a notebook he never let me see. It was like a part of him had stayed behind in that dark place, even after the shadow was sealed away. I couldn't bring myself to go into the attic. The thought of the mirror sitting there, wrapped in the old blanket, made my skin crawl. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind that rattled the windows, I convinced myself it was nothing. But the whispers in my dreams told a different story. They called my name, soft, pleading. "Aaron. Aaron. Let me out." Sometimes it wasn't just the voice of the shadow. It was Ryan's voice, too. I didn't tell him about the dreams. He was already struggling enough, and I didn't want him to worry. Or maybe I was the one who was scared that he would confirm my worst fear, that it wasn't over. One cold, rainy afternoon, I found myself standing at the bottom of the attic stairs. I don't know what pulled me there, maybe curiosity, maybe a sense of duty. I needed to know if the mirror was still safe, still sealed. I took a deep breath and started climbing the creaky wooden steps. The attic was dim, the only light coming from a small, dusty window. The air smelled musty, like old books and forgotten things. I spotted the blanket right away, huddled in the corner like it was hiding. My heartbeat quickened as I approached it, every nerve in my body screaming at me to turn back. I knelt down, hesitating for a moment before pulling the blanket away. The mirror was still there, the glass dark and unreflective. My blood, dried now, had left a brownish stain across the surface, like a scar. I reached out to touch it, then stopped. There, beneath the dried blood, I saw something that made my stomach drop, a crack. It was thin, almost invisible, like a spider's thread stretching from one corner of the mirror to the center. I felt cold all over, like someone had poured ice water down my spine. The crack hadn't been there before. I was sure of it. Before I could react, the whispering started again. It was louder now, more desperate. "Aaron, please. I'm trapped. Help me." I stumbled back, nearly falling over. It wasn't the shadow's voice anymore. It was Ryan's. "No," I muttered, shaking my head. "You're lying. Ryan is downstairs. He's fine." The whisper turned into a soft, broken laugh. "Is he?" it asked, mocking me. "Are you sure, Aaron?" My hands were shaking. I wanted to smash the mirror, to break it into a million pieces and be done with it. But something stopped me. I remembered the way the shadow had looked, pressed against the glass, the hunger in its eyes. If I broke the mirror, I might set it free. I wrapped the blanket back around it, shoving it deeper into the corner. I couldn't destroy it, but I could keep it hidden, keep it buried. I just had to be strong enough to ignore it. That night, the storm outside was fierce. Rain lashed against the windows, and the wind howled like a wild animal. I couldn't sleep. I tossed and turned, every flash of lightning casting strange shadows across my room. I got up, thinking maybe a glass of water would help. I tiptoed down the hallway, careful not to wake anyone. As I passed Ryan's door, I hesitated. It was slightly ajar, and I could see the dim glow of his bedside lamp. He never left the light on. My heart raced as I pushed the door open. Ryan was sitting on his bed, his back to me. He was hunched over, scribbling furiously in his notebook. The sound of the pencil scratching against the paper was almost frantic. "Ryan?" I whispered. He didn't respond. I stepped closer, peeking over his shoulder. My blood ran cold when I saw what he was drawing. It was the mirror. Over and over again, the same image filling every page. But in each drawing, the crack was wider, splitting the mirror in two, and from the crack, shadows poured out like black smoke. "Ryan." I grabbed his shoulder, shaking him. He turned slowly to face me, and I stumbled back in horror. His eyes weren't his. They were pitch black, like two bottomless pits, staring straight through me. "You shouldn't have left it," he said, his voice low and distorted, like two voices speaking at once, Ryan's and something else. "You didn't seal it properly, Aaron. Now it's too late." I felt like I was drowning, my mind spinning. "What are you talking about?" "It's still in the attic, it's still trapped." Ryan, or whatever was inside him, smiled. It was a cruel, twisted smile that didn't belong on my brother's face. "For now," he said. "But not for long." He lunged at me, his hands grabbing my arms with a strength I didn't know he had. I struggled, trying to pull away, but his grip was like iron. "You let it in," he hissed. "And now it wants more." I screamed, thrashing against him. The room seemed to spin, the shadows on the walls stretching out like they were alive, reaching for me. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Ryan collapsed, his body going limp. I caught him before he hit the ground, shaking him frantically. "Ryan, wake up." He opened his eyes slowly, the blackness fading away, replaced by his familiar, soft brown eyes. He looked up at me, tears welling up. "Aaron," he whispered, his voice back to normal. "It's still here. It's inside me." I held him close, tears streaming down my face. I had been wrong. The shadow hadn't just been trapped in the mirror, it had found a new home, a new host. And it was my brother. We were out of time. I couldn't fight this thing alone, not anymore. I needed help, someone who knew about these kinds of curses and dark spirits. I thought of old Mrs. Callahan down the street, the strange woman who everyone in the neighborhood whispered about. They said she knew things about the old world, about spirits and curses. It was a risk, but I was willing to take it. Because if I didn't, I might lose Ryan for good. I helped him to his feet, his body trembling like a leaf in the wind. "Stay with me," I whispered. "I'm going to fix this. I promise." He nodded weakly, but I could see the fear in his eyes. He didn't believe me, and I wasn't sure if I believed myself. As I guided him down the stairs, a single thought echoed in my mind, louder than the storm raging outside. The shadow wasn't just after him anymore. It was after both of us. Ryan's steps were heavy as we moved down the creaky stairs, his arm draped over my shoulder for support. The storm outside battered against the windows, and thunder rumbled like an ominous warning. My heart raced, each beat a reminder that time was running out. I needed to get him out of the house, away from the attic, away from the mirror. But even as I thought it, I could feel a pull, like invisible hands tugging us back. The shadow wasn't done with us yet. The living room was dim, the flickering light from the street lamps casting long, dancing shadows across the walls. I could see Mom and Dad's room door closed tight at the end of the hall. They were still asleep, oblivious to the nightmare unfolding just beyond their door. I was glad. They wouldn't understand, and I couldn't waste time explaining. Ryan slumped onto the couch, his face pale, eyes hollow. He clutched his head like he was in pain. "Aaron," he whispered, "it's whispering again." I knelt beside him, grabbing his hand. It was cold, like ice. "What's it saying?" He winced, squeezing his eyes shut. It's telling me things. Horrible things. It wants to hurt you, Aaron. It wants me to hurt you." A shiver ran down my spine, but I forced a smile. "You won't," I said, squeezing his hand tighter. "You're stronger than it is, Ryan. We just have to hold on a little longer. I'm going to get help." He opened his eyes, and for a brief moment, I saw the old Ryan, the brother who used to tease me, who shared his candy with me, who protected me from bullies at school. "Promise me you won't leave me alone," he pleaded, his voice small and broken. I swallowed hard. "I promise." But it was a promise I couldn't keep. I left Ryan on the couch, bundled under a thick blanket. He was shivering, but it wasn't from the cold. I could see the shadow lurking in his eyes, like a dark fog rolling in. I didn't have much time. I threw on my raincoat and slipped out the front door, the rain pounding against me as soon as I stepped outside. The wind howled, whipping through the trees and rattling the fences. I kept my head down and ran, my shoes slapping against the wet pavement as I made my way down Willow Street. Mrs. Callahan's house was at the very end of the road, half hidden behind gnarled oak trees. It was the kind of place kids avoided on Halloween, with its peeling paint and broken shutters. Well, tonight, it felt like the only safe place left. I banged on the door, breathless, my fists sore from pounding against the wood. "Mrs. Callahan," I shouted. "Please, it's an emergency." The door creaked open slowly, and there she stood, small and hunched, her gray hair pulled back in a tight bun. Her eyes, sharp and knowing, met mine. "You shouldn't be here, boy," she said, her voice a raspy whisper. "The storm isn't the only thing in the air tonight." "Please," I begged, the rain running down my face, mixing with my tears. "It's my brother. He's been possessed by something. A shadow from an old mirror. I need your help." Her expression softened, and she stepped aside, motioning for me to come in. "I warned your parents not to keep that cursed thing," she muttered as she closed the door behind me. "But they didn't listen." My heart sank. "You knew?" She nodded, shuffling into her cluttered living room, filled with strange herbs hanging from the ceiling and jars of what looked like dried roots and animal bones. "The mirror belonged to my grandmother," she explained. "It's a portal, a gateway for spirits that should never have been disturbed. I sealed it long ago, but someone must have broken the seal." "I did," I admitted, my voice small. "I didn't know. I just wanted to help Ryan." Mrs. Callahan gave me a sad smile. "Your heart was in the right place, child. But the spirit inside that mirror is ancient and malevolent. It feeds on fear, on anger. It's taken hold of your brother, and it won't let go easily." "Can you stop it?" I asked, desperation creeping into my voice. "Please, you have to save him." She sighed, reaching for a small black book on her shelf. It looked old, the leather cracked and faded. "I can try," she said. But it won't be easy. The shadow is strong now. It's tasted freedom, and it won't go back willingly. I nodded, wiping the rain from my eyes. I'll do anything. Just tell me what to do. We hurried back to the house, Mrs. Callahan's frail form moving faster than I expected. She clutched a bundle of herbs in the black book tightly, her face set in grim determination. As we stepped inside, the temperature dropped sharply. I could see my breath in the air, and the shadows seemed to stretch and twist, as if they were watching us. Ryan was still on the couch, but he wasn't alone. The shadow hovered behind him, a dark, shifting shape that seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. It turned its head slowly, fixing its hollow, black eyes on me. Too late, it hissed, its voice like the rustling of dead leaves. He's mine now. Mrs. Callahan stepped forward, her eyes blazing. Not yet, you wretched thing, she spat. She tossed a handful of the herbs into the air, and they burst into flame, filling the room with a sharp, bitter smell. The shadow recoiled, screeching, and for a moment, I saw Ryan's face, pale and frightened. Aaron, he gasped, reaching out for me. Help me. I ran to his side, grabbing his hand. It was cold, so cold. I'm here, Ryan, I said. Hold on. We're going to get you out of this. Mrs. Callahan began chanting, her voice low and rhythmic, the words strange and guttural. The shadow writhed, pulling at Ryan, trying to drag him back. He screamed, a sound that tore through me, filled with pure, raw terror. I held onto him tighter. Fight it, Ryan, I shouted. You have to fight it. The shadow lunged at me, its claw-like hands reaching for my throat. But before it could touch me, Mrs. Callahan threw a circle of salt around us, and the shadow was thrown back with a hiss. It's weakening, she shouted. Now, Aaron. Call to him. Call your brother back. I looked into Ryan's eyes, seeing the flicker of the shadow still there, lurking. Ryan, I whispered. You're stronger than it. I know you are. Come back to me. Please. For a moment, everything went silent. The shadow stopped moving, its form shivering, fading. And then, with a final, ear-splitting scream, it evaporated, sucked back into the cracks of the mirror like smoke into a bottle. Ryan collapsed into my arms, sobbing. Aaron, he whispered. It's gone. I think it's really gone. I held him close, tears streaming down my face. You did it, I said. We did it. Mrs. Callahan gave a weary smile, wiping the sweat from her brow. For now, she said. But the mirror still holds the curse. It must be destroyed. I nodded, looking at the dark glass, the crack now a jagged scar across its surface. I picked up a hammer, feeling its weight in my hand. This time, I didn't hesitate. With a single powerful swing, I brought it down. The mirror shattered, a million pieces scattering across the floor like drops of black ink. The shadow was gone. And so was the curse. I hope. For now, Ryan and I must dip. Bye.